Welcome to our second installment of Chapter 26, Screencast, the Unification of Japan. Now, Japan from the 12th to 16th century was marked by civil war. If you remember the end of the Warring States period in China, just prior to the Shin Dynasty, this was a similar situation in Japan. In fact, it was called Sengoku, the country at war. The emperor at this time was merely a figurehead. Remember my bobbleheads in my classroom? Well, they just kind of stand there and their heads bobble. Well, that's pretty much what the emperor was like. He reigned, but he did not rule. Now, this is important to keep in mind, and I'd like you to just kind of underline that word figurehead, because it's important for us in the future to know that there will be a distinct change when the emperor will become a supreme ruler. But at this point in time, he did reign, but he did not control Japan. Who did end up controlling and unifying Japan was Tokugawa Ieyasu. He is very much like Shin Shiwangdi in the fact that he brought together warring tribes. He had a military government, and he established the bakufu. So underline the word bakufu. This means tent government. Now, a tent is something you put up and you take down. The idea was that this government was going to be temporary, but in essence, it really wasn't. And it, in fact, was the beginning of the Tokugawa dynasty, which would rule Japan from 1600 to 1867. Now, what the Tokugawa needed to do was to control the daimyo, the great names. These were the rulers, the shoguns in Japan, who had vast land holdings and who had loyal people, soldiers and samurais that were below them. And so what the Tokugawa required was alternate attendance. Every other year, the daimyo were forced to spend their year at the court in Edo or Tokyo. This way they would meet together and they could successfully prohibit, the Tokugawa could, these daimyo from building up forces at home that could potentially overthrow the Tokugawa. So they controlled marriage, they controlled the marriage contracts, they controlled the social life of the daimyo when they were in Edo. Beginning in the 1630s, the shoguns also restricted foreign relations, and they restricted travel. The import of books was also forbidden, and we'll be talking more about that in class. Economic growth. The end of civil conflict is just going to contribute to prosperity. If you think about it, you're not warring. The people are more confident. You can produce products. They are getting new crop strains. They're building up irrigation systems. Now, when you look at the population growth from 1600 to 1850, we go from about 22 million to about 32 million. So that it is a 50% growth rate, but not as much as some parts of the world experienced at that point in time. And this is because Japan had access to contraception. They encouraged late marriage, which would reduce the family size, and they also had abortion. Additionally, they committed infanticide, which we talked about in China, as well as other parts of the world, and they called this thinning out the rice shoots. Social change. The end of the civil disturbances is going to create massive employment of the daimyo and the samurai warriors. And so if you look at if you've ever seen the movie The Last Samurai, for example, you can see how the samurai had really become obsolete. We really didn't need these highly trained warriors anymore because we had peace. And so the daimyo and the samurai were encouraged to study. They were encouraged to join the bureaucracy, but many of them, in fact, declined into poverty. However, an urban wealthy class did develop from trade activity, and so we see the beginnings of a very stratified society based on wealth, material wealth. Additionally, we see xenophobia. This is a term that means fear of the foreigner. So, circle, underline, do whatever you need to do to remember this word. This is going to be very important in Japanese history in the centuries to follow this. The isolationism of Japan bred in them a sense of superiority and a fear of the foreigner. They still had important Chinese traditions that they carried on, as well as Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism, but they really focused on Japanese culture and their believed superiority of Japanese culture. And these are called native learners. So the idea was to emphasize the traditional Japanese religion, classics, and stories and mythology. The picture that you see here is actually from their creation myth, and it was about how the two gods portrayed here stir up the waters and the islands of Japan are created. Now, culturally, floating worlds was what the urban culture was referred to as. Floating worlds would imply that these are worlds separate from the rest of the world, and that's kind of what it was like. This was an urban cultural center that had entertainment and pleasure industries, and these developed in response to the alternate attendance policies of the Tokugawa, because there were many men that were gathered, the daimyo, that were gathered in the urban centers, and so these pleasure centers would grow up to meet the needs of that community. The banruko, or puppet theater, was one particular form of theater that developed in the floating worlds. I'm going to show you about 1 minute of a video clip that shows what the banruko puppets look like.
Ranking along with No and Kabuki as one of Japan's foremost traditional stage arts, the Ningyo Jorori Bunraku Puppet Theatre is a blend of sung narrative, instrumental accompaniment, and puppet drama. This theatrical form emerged during the early Edo period, around 1600, when puppetry was coupled with Jorori, a popular 15th century narrative genre. In the mid-17th century, numerous permanent commercial theatres were devoted specifically to puppet performances and kabuki, and by the mid-18th century, Ningyo Jorori had adopted its characteristic staging style. The genre acquired its present full name, Ningyo Jorori Bunraku, in the late 19th century. The Bunraku-za was a leading theatre of the period.
Okay, so that was a look at one of the unique entertainment options that was available during the Tokugawa period and the puppet theater in particular. This is a Japanese screen showing the arrival of Jesuits in Japan around 1549. So, as we already have talked about, the Jesuits went to China as well as Japan, as well as many other parts of the world, as we know. And this is not long after the Council of Trent actually was established. So Christianity in Japan. Jesuit Francis Xavier went to Japan in 1549, and at first he found great success with the daimyo. In fact, many of them were claiming to convert to Christianity. However, some people think that perhaps that they converted for trade benefits. There was a government backlash to this conversion of the daimyo and fear of foreign intrusion. They resented, as did the Chinese, the Christian idea of absolutism, that Christianity was the one and only way. And that was one of the problems that led to a serious anti-Christian campaign from 1587 to 1639. Now, this period of time saw Christianity severely restricted and even Christians being executed, sometimes by crucifixion. Now, the final note here on Japan is Dutch learning. So the Dutch presence, the Dutch had created a relationship with the Japanese in Nagasaki, and this would end up being the principal conduit for the Japanese understanding of the world. Before the ban on foreign books was lifted in Japan in 1720, the Japanese scholars studied the Dutch approaches to European technology, medicine, and art. So it was through the Dutch that the Japanese had contact and instruction about what was going on in Europe, and likewise through the Dutch that Europe learned about what was going on in Japan. So the key lessons about Japan are the Bakufu, the tent government, and the Tokugawa shogunate, Tokugawa Ieyasu. And we also learn about their isolationism, and also remember their xenophobia, and also remember their Dutch learning and the lack of Christianity taking hold in Japan as well as in China. Thank you for listening to part 2. Have a great day.